Somewhere in the last 5 years a transfer happened, and almost nobody was told it was happening. A 26-year-old saving cash for a house deposit, doing the most responsible thing anyone had ever advised, watched the thing they were saving for move 40% further away, while the money in the account bought less every month for 2 years. Someone who bought that same house 1 year earlier got paid twice, once in appreciation and once in the quiet erosion of what they owed. Neither of them behaved differently. One of them was born 5 years earlier. Across the same window, real wages in the United States fell for 24 consecutive months, the longest run ever recorded, while American billionaires added $2 trillion. Those are not two stories. They are one event, and the rule that decided who came out of it on which side was not written by anybody alive or by anybody American. It was set down in about 4 pages of French around 1730 by a banker who understood it well enough to become the richest Irishman in Europe, and who then died in a house fire that may not have been his death. Tonight we go from the Rue Quincampoix in 1720 to a headless body on Albemarle Street, to an industrialist buying the Ruhr with borrowed marks, to the 24 firms standing closest to the money today, and to one sentence the Bank of England published about its own programme in 2012. Get comfortable and stay to the end, because by the close, you will be able to name your own position in that order and say exactly why it does not move. Ad-free episodes live over on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of, along with early access and an audio-only feed for listening with the screen off. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's ease into it. On the night of the 14th of May, 1734, a house on Albemarle Street in London burned to the ground, and when they pulled the wreckage apart the next morning, they found a body in it with no head. The house belonged to a man named Richard Cantillon, Irish by birth, French by fortune, and at that moment almost certainly the wealthiest private individual of Irish extraction alive anywhere in Europe. The first report said he had fallen asleep, reading by candlelight. That version lasted about a week, because when someone actually examined the remains, the conclusion was that the man had died before the fire started, not during it, and the cook he had dismissed days earlier had gone missing along with a quantity of silver plate. Cantillon's own relative posted a reward of £200 for anyone who would name the accomplices. Several of the household servants were tried. Every one of them was acquitted. Nobody was ever convicted of anything. And then, some months later, in the Dutch colony of Surinam, on the northern coast of South America, a man stepped ashore calling himself the Chevalier de Louvigny. He was carrying gold, rifles, and a barrel of gunpowder. When the colonial authorities became interested in him, he abandoned his luggage and disappeared into the interior. Among the papers he left behind were documents belonging to Richard Cantillon. His modern biographer, Antoine Murphy of Trinity College Dublin, published the case for the obvious reading of that in 1986. Cantillon had been sued so relentlessly by so many people for so much money that he burned his own house down, put a corpse in it, and left. Whether that corpse was a man he killed or a man he bought is a question the record does not answer. There is a grave in Old St. Pancras churchyard in London with his name on it. There is also a man with his papers walking into the jungle. Take your pick. Here is the part that matters. Every single thing Richard Cantillon ever wrote was destroyed in that fire, with one exception. One manuscript survived, and it survived because he had already given a copy of it away. It circulated privately, hand to hand, among a small number of French aristocrats for the next 21 years, and when it was finally printed in 1755, the title page carried a publisher's name and address that were fraudulent. The publisher had been dead for 14 years. That manuscript contains the answer to a question you have probably asked out loud in the last 5 years and never had answered properly. Why does everything cost more? Why does your salary not move? And who is standing at the other end of that arrangement? Cantillon answered it in about 4 pages of 18th century French, and the answer he gives is mechanical rather than moral, and specific rather than vague. New money does not arrive everywhere at once. It has an entry point. It arrives at a specific address in specific hands, and those hands spend it at the old prices before the prices have any way of knowing that more money exists. The people who receive it second spend it at prices that have moved slightly. The people who receive it third spend at prices that have moved more. And the people at the end of the queue, the ones whose income is a fixed number written on a contract, do not receive it at all in any meaningful sense. They receive the prices. They pay the entire cost of the expansion, and they collect none of the benefit, and they do this every single time, in every century, under every government, regardless of who is in power and regardless of what anyone intended. The order is fixed. That is the finding. Not that inflation hurts the poor, which everyone says and nobody does the arithmetic on. The finding is that there is a queue, that your position in it is determined by your proximity to the point where the money is created, and that the sequence does not vary. Inflation reaches you as a level, a general rise in prices, a single number with a percentage sign after it, published monthly, arriving like weather. That framing is worse than simplified. It misleads in a very specific direction, because a level has no order of arrival. A level happens to everybody. A sequence happens to somebody first. And I want to plant something here, because it will take about 2 hours to pay off, and I want you holding it the whole time. When you want to hide something, burying it is the amateur move. Buried things get dug up. The professional move is to build the instrument that measures the thing in such a way that the thing cannot register on it. Then you do not have to hide anything. You can publish everything. You can hold press conferences. You can put the data on a public website and update it weekly, and the thing you would rather nobody noticed will simply not appear, because the instrument has no channel for it. Remember that. We are going to come back to it with names attached. Ballyhaig, County Kerry, on the west coast of Ireland, sometime in the 1680s. The exact year is genuinely unknown, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Some sources give a specific date in the 1690s, and one 19th century account puts his birth as late as 1697, but the man was already running payment operations for the British Paymaster General by 1711, and nobody hands a 14-year-old that job. The 1680s is the defensible answer, and the honest thing to say is that we do not have his birth certificate, because the family he was born into was in the process of losing everything, including its paperwork. The Cantillons were Hiberno-Norman landowners, old money by Irish standards, which is to say they had been there since the 12th century and had spent most of that time managing the slow arithmetic of holding property in a country that kept changing hands. They were Catholic and they were Jacobite, and in the Williamite War they backed James II, and James II lost. What follows from that is the part that shaped everything Richard Cantillon ever did. The family lands were confiscated, not taxed, not devalued, not lost in a bad harvest, transferred by legal instrument to somebody else in a process where the paper moved and the soil did not. He grew up watching wealth get relocated by decree while the physical world stayed exactly where it was. Then he left, with the tens of thousands of other dispossessed Irish Catholic gentry who scattered into the armies and counting houses of Catholic Europe in that generation, the ones the Irish still call the wild geese. I am telling you this not as background colour, but because it is load-bearing. The man who would eventually explain, more precisely than anyone before or since, that the movement of money is a transfer from one named group to another named group, was a child of a family that had been on the wrong end of exactly that operation, executed by statute. By 1711 he was in Spain, working for James Bridges, the British Paymaster General, later the first Duke of Chandos. The job was organising payments to British prisoners of war during the War of the Spanish Succession, which sounds like clerical work and was in fact an education in the single most valuable skill in early modern finance. Moving large sums across hostile borders in multiple currencies at rates you had to price yourself, with counterparties who might default and a war going on in between. He stayed until 1714. He came out of it with a network and with an understanding of foreign exchange that almost nobody in Europe possessed. Then he went to Paris, took a position in a family bank run by a cousin, and, backed by Bridges' money, bought the cousin out. The bank became his. In Paris he was known simply as the Irish banker, and in 1722 he married Mary Ann O'Mahony, the daughter of Count Daniel O'Mahony of Killarney, which tells you precisely how the Jacobite exile network functioned. They married each other, banked each other, and waited. Therefore, when the largest monetary experiment in European history detonated directly in front of him, he was the one man in Paris, standing in the right place, with the right instruments and the right complete absence of illusions. The experiment was called John Law. Law was a Scot, a convicted killer who had escaped custody after a duel, a gambler with a genuine mathematical gift and a theory about money that was 2 centuries ahead of its time and about 18 months ahead of its ability to survive contact with reality. His theory was this: France was drowning in debt from the wars of Louis XIV, and the constraint on the French economy was not productive capacity, but the quantity of circulating money, which was limited by the amount of metal in the country. Remove the metal constraint, issue paper, and the economy expands to fill the space. He got the chance to run the experiment. In 1716 he was granted a charter for a bank that issued notes. That became the Banque Royale, effectively the first French central bank. In parallel he built a trading company, the Compagnie d'Occident, which absorbed France's other trading monopolies and became the entity history remembers as the Mississippi Company, holding development rights to the entire Louisiana territory. And then he did the thing that made him either the inventor of modern finance or its first great criminal, depending on which historian you read. He merged the two. The bank that printed the money and the company that issued the shares became a single machine, and the machine was permitted to accept government debt in exchange for equity. What happened next is the template for everything that has happened since. Shares in the Mississippi Company were issued at 500 livres. Within about 18 months they were trading around 10,000. That is a 20-fold increase in the price of a claim on a swamp nobody had visited. The Rue Quincampoix, the narrow Paris street where the shares changed hands, became so dense with speculators that people rented out windowsills. A hunchback reportedly made a living letting traders use his back as a writing desk. The word millionaire enters the French language in this period, and it enters it because it was suddenly needed. Cantillon was in it early. He bought, and as the price climbed toward the mania he sold. And his profit on that single exit is reported at around £50,000 sterling. To give you the shape of that number, £50,000 in 1720 was not the price of a nice house. It was the price of a substantial landed estate with the village attached, several times over, measured against average earnings of the period rather than against a basket of goods. It lands somewhere in the tens of millions of pounds in modern terms, and I want to be honest that historical currency conversions across 3 centuries are method dependent and anyone who gives you a single confident figure is selling you something. But the share sale is not the interesting part, and it is not what makes him relevant to your life. The interesting part is what he did next, because it was the first documented instance of a man making a fortune by correctly modelling the mechanism he would later write down. Cantillon understood something that law either did not understand or could not admit. Once shares had been driven to 10,000 livres on the strength of paper issuance, they could only be held there by more paper issuance. The system had no other move. Any pause in the printing and the price would fall, and a falling price would trigger sales, and sales would require the bank to buy shares with newly printed notes, which would require more printing. Law was, by late 1719 and into 1720, publicly committed to defending a floor near 9,000 livres per share, and the only instrument he had for defending it was the note press. Therefore the shares were not the exposure. The currency was the exposure. Every additional note issued to hold up the share price was a small reduction in the value of the livre itself, and the place that reduction would first become visible was not in French shop prices, which are sticky and slow, but in the foreign exchange market, where the livre traded against sterling and the Dutch guilder in real time against traders who had no patriotic reason to pretend. He was the Irish banker. Foreign exchange was the thing he had learned in Spain. He shorted the livre. And then he did something that is either the purest expression of financial genius or one of the most cold-blooded manoeuvres in the history of European banking, and the reason it is remembered as the second is that it involved specific named human beings who trusted him. He lent money to speculators so they could buy more shares, taking their existing shares as collateral. This is margin lending, and it is the same instrument that operates in every leveraged blow-up from 1720 to 2008. His clients were pyramiding. They would deposit shares, borrow against them, buy more shares with the borrowed money, deposit those, borrow again. On the way up, this is a machine for turning a small position into an enormous one. On the way down, it is a machine for transferring the entire position to the lender. His two most famous clients were Lady Mary Herbert, daughter of the Marquess of Powys, and Joseph Edward Gage, an English Catholic gentleman with an appetite for risk that outran his judgment by a considerable margin. They were, by any reasonable measure, the smart money. Aristocratic, connected, early into the trade, they borrowed from Cantillon to pyramid their Mississippi holdings. The system collapsed in 1720. Shares went from 10,000 livres to effectively nothing across the course of a year. The Banque Royale's notes became worthless. Law fled France in disguise and died in Venice 9 years later with almost nothing, having lost a fortune that at its peak may have made him the richest man in Europe, and Cantillon, who had taken his client's shares as collateral for loans denominated in a currency he had simultaneously sold short, converted his position into sterling and moved the capital to London and Amsterdam before the exits closed. When the livre collapsed, his sterling holdings were worth a fortune in hard money. The Mises Institute's account of him uses the phrase multi-millionaire, and it is not an exaggeration. The Herbert family, meanwhile, ended up facing debts of over £170,000. They sued him. Of course they sued him. Lady Mary Herbert and Joseph Gage pursued Richard Cantillon through the courts of Paris and London for the rest of his life, and in Gage's case, beyond it. Gage was still litigating against Cantillon's heirs in 1754, 20 years after the man was declared dead. A printed legal memorandum survives from 1730, a document titled simply a memorandum for Richard Cantillon, merchant of Paris, in which the Paris bankers Jean and Remy Carroll accuse him of practising, in their words, the most enormous usury. 18 folio pages of it. and in a letter of his own dated the 21st of June 1730, Cantillon wrote a sentence that I find almost unbearably revealing. He said that, had he stayed in the scheme from the beginning, he never should have had any of these lawsuits. Read that again. He is not saying he regrets what he did. He is saying that if he had been a fool along with everyone else, if he had ridden it up and ridden it back down and lost everything like Law and the Herberts and half the aristocracy of France, nobody would have sued him. He is being sued for having been right. And he is correct about that. That is precisely why he was being sued. But there is a reason this is more than a good story about a clever crook. The obvious reading of Richard Cantillon is that he got rich because he was smarter than everyone else in the room. That reading is comfortable, and it is wrong, and he himself is the one who demonstrates that it is wrong. Because in the same decade that he was defending himself against these lawsuits, sometime around 1730, in French, in a manuscript he showed to almost nobody, he sat down and explained that intelligence had very little to do with it. What mattered was where you were standing. The manuscript is called Essai sur la nature du commerce en général. Essay on the nature of commerce in general. It runs to 3 parts, and it is, by a wide margin, the first thing anyone wrote that a modern economist would recognise as economics, rather than as moral philosophy with numbers in it. Part 1 builds the machinery. It defines wealth not as money, but as the consumable goods produced by land and labour, which is a distinction that took the rest of the profession about a century to catch up to. It explains why villages become towns and towns become cities and cities become capitals, and it does so in terms of transport costs and the location of landowners, which is spatial economics roughly 200 years before spatial economics. It introduces the entrepreneur as a distinct economic actor, defined not by ownership or by cleverness, but by the structure of his exposure. In the Higgs translation, the word is rendered as undertaker, and the definition is that he buys at prices that are certain in order to sell at prices that are not. That is risk-bearing as an economic function, and it is the first time anyone had isolated it. It works out a relationship between land and labour that Cantillon calls the par, and it lays out a theory of population limited by subsistence that Malthus would publish to enormous acclaim more than 60 years later. Part 3 handles foreign trade, exchange rates, trade policy, banking and credit, and Jevons would later say that this section is almost beyond praise. Part 2 is the one that concerns you. Part 2 is about money. And in Part 2, Cantillon asks a question that sounds so ordinary that it is easy to miss how radical it is. He asks in what way, and in what proportion, an increase in the quantity of money raises prices. Everyone before him, and a great many people after him, treated that as a question with a one-line answer. More money, higher prices, roughly in proportion. Double the money, double the prices. This is the quantity theory in its crude form, and it is not wrong exactly. Over long enough periods and in aggregate, it holds up reasonably well. Cantillon's move was to refuse the aggregate. He asked what actually physically happens, step by step, person by person, as the new money moves. His answer, in the original French, is this: L'augmentation de l'argent qui se répand dans un état n'est pas toujours répartie également parmi tous ses habitants. The increase of money circulating in a state is not always distributed equally among all its inhabitants. That sentence is the whole thing. Everything else in this story is a footnote to that sentence, including the Federal Reserve. And then, he does the thing that separates him from every other writer of his era. He works the example. He imagines new money entering a country not through a printing press, which he was living through, but through a mine. Gold or silver discovered and worked inside the state. And he asks, with almost forensic patience, who touches it first. In Higgs's English, The answer is the owner of the mine, the adventurers, the smelters, the refiners, and all the other workers. Those are the first hands. And the crucial observation, the observation that nobody else made, is that these people will increase their expenses in proportion to their gains. They will consume more. Not abstractly more. Specifically more of specific things, chosen according to their own tastes and their own idea of what wealth is for. They eat more meat. They drink more wine and more beer. They buy better cloth and finer linen. They build houses with more ornament than the houses they had before. And every one of those purchases is made at the price that existed before the gold came out of the ground. Because the shopkeepers of the district have no way of knowing that the money supply of the state has just changed. There is no announcement. There is no data release. There is a man who did not previously have money walking into a shop and buying the best cut at yesterday's price. Then, gradually, the shopkeeper notices. He notices that the good cuts are selling out. He raises the price. The vintner notices. He raises the price. The tailor notices. He raises the price of the finer cloth first, because that is what is being bought, and the coarse cloth later, or not at all. This is the part that almost everyone who invokes Cantillon in a comment section gets wrong, so I want to be precise about it. The prices do not all rise. Cantillon's claim is not that a monetary expansion raises the general price level by some percentage. His claim is that the new spending is directed more or less to certain kinds of products or merchandise, according to the idea of those who acquire the money, and therefore, in his words, market prices will rise more for certain things than for others. The distortion is in the relative prices. The structure of the economy is bent toward whatever the first recipients happen to want. He notes, for instance, that the price of meat in England could triple while other goods lagged far behind, and he means that literally as an observed asymmetry, not as a rhetorical flourish. Which brings us to the Q, and the Q is where the paper stops being clever and starts being an indictment. Cantillon names the losers in order. Those who will suffer from these higher prices and increased consumption will be, first of all, the property owners during the term of their leases, then their domestic servants, and then all the workmen or fixed wage earners who support their families on a salary. Look at the mechanism there. Because it is exact. A landlord who has signed a 21-year lease has contracted to receive a fixed number of coins per year. When the purchasing power of a coin falls, he has not been robbed by anyone. Nobody took anything from him. He simply continues to receive the number he agreed to, and that number now buys less meat. His servants are on fixed wages, so the same thing happens to them, one link further down. And then everyone whose income is a number written on an agreement, which in 1730 meant most of the population and in the 2020s means most of the population, absorbs the entire adjustment. The mine owner got new money at old prices. The wage earner got old money at new prices. That is the Cantillon effect. That is the entire thing. And it took 248 years for anyone to give it that name, which we will get to. But the reason I called it an indictment rather than an observation is what Cantillon does with it next. Because he does not stop at the domestic distribution. He follows the money out of the country. If the internal price level of a state rises because it has been mining or printing money, then that state's manufactures become expensive relative to everyone else's. Foreigners undersell it. Its own citizens buy imports, because imports are now cheap. And therefore, in Cantillon's words, the money will necessarily go abroad to pay for the imports. The gold leaves. The mine that made the country rich makes the country poor, and it does so through the same mechanism that made it rich. And Cantillon says the state ends up in a way dependent on foreigners. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because he wrote it in 1730, and it describes the industrial history of every reserve currency issuer of the last 100 years, the country that gets to create the money loses the ability to make things, because the money creation raises its own cost structure faster than its competitors. This is not a theory that anyone was arguing about in the 18th century. It is a theory that nobody had thought of. And now the irony, which I think is the single most important fact about this document. Cantillon warns against paper money. He warns against national banks. He is scathing about what he calls fictitious money, the credit expansion of institutions like the Bank of England and the South Sea Company. He argues that bimetallism, running gold and silver simultaneously at a fixed legal ratio, causes money shortages, which was a genuinely sophisticated position, and one that took another century and a half of monetary disasters to become conventional wisdom. In other words, the manuscript is a systematic theoretical refutation of the John Law system, written by the man who made his fortune out of the John Law system. He is not a whistleblower, he is not a reformer, he is the single largest documented private beneficiary of the exact mechanism he is describing, writing down the mechanism in precise detail while being sued by his victims, and then showing the manuscript to almost nobody. I have thought about this for longer than is probably healthy, and I still do not know what to do with it. The most complete description we have of how monetary expansion transfers wealth from wage earners to asset holders was written by the asset holder, not by an economist observing from outside, by the man at the front of the queue who had counted the queue and who knew exactly where every person in it was standing, because he had put some of them there. There is a version of this story where that discredits the analysis. That version is wrong, and it is worth being clear about why. He is not a hostile witness. He is the only kind of witness who would actually know. The man at the front of the queue is the only person in the entire system with a complete view of it, because he is the only one who can see everyone behind him. Everybody else in 1720 was inside the event. He was operating on it. Therefore, the obvious question is why you have never heard of him. And the answer to that is not the answer you are expecting. Here is the sequence of events by which the founding document of economics was removed from the history of economics, and I want to lay it out as a chain, because the chain is the point. Cantillon dies, or does not die, in 1734. The manuscript is in the hands of a French aristocrat named Victor de Riquetti, the Marquis de Mirabeau. We know Mirabeau had it, and we know roughly when, because a letter of his to a Swiss correspondent named Frédéric de Saconnaix, dated the 12th of October, 1740, shows him already in possession of it. He obtained Cantillon's own French version through an intermediary. He held it for 16 years, and he intended to publish it. Under a specific arrangement with himself, Mirabeau wrote, in the preface to his own book L'Armée des Hommes, that he began it in the form of a free commentary on an outstanding work which he possessed in manuscript form and intended to publish. That is his own account, in print. And then, having found that his interests had diverged from Cantillon's, he decided instead, again in his own words, to publish under his own name the scattered and hitherto abandoned fragments. Scholars working on the correspondence, in a study published in the journal History of Political Economy, place the moment of that decision around 1756. Read the phrasing carefully. Abandoned fragments. He is describing the most advanced work of economic analysis then in existence, by a man whose lawsuits were still active in the Paris courts, as abandoned fragments that he would now publish under his own name. Mirabeau did not steal it in the end. But he became one of the founding figures of the physiocrats, the first organised school of economics in Europe, and the physiocrats' central document, François Quesnay's Tableau économique, runs on Cantillon's circular flow analysis and Cantillon's landowner-centred model of the economy. A 19th century French economist named Léonce de Laverne eventually said the quiet part out loud. In Cantillon, he wrote, "All the theories of the economists are contained in advance. An entire school was built on the manuscript, while the author's name detached from it." But the more consequential erasure is in English, and it belongs to Adam Smith. Smith cites Cantillon exactly once in The Wealth of Nations. Once, it is in Book 1, Chapter 8, on the wages of labour, immediately after Smith establishes that wages must be at least sufficient to sustain the worker and his family. The line reads that Mr. Cantillon seems, upon this account, to suppose that the lowest species of common labourers must everywhere earn at least double their own maintenance. That is it. One sentence on a minor point about subsistence wages. There is a scholarly argument which has run for over a century, and which I'm not going to pretend is settled, about how much more Smith took without attribution. What is not in dispute is the thing that actually matters here, and it has nothing to do with plagiarism. It is this: Smith did not reproduce the mechanism. The sequential, unequal order of arrival analysis of monetary expansion, the single most original thing in the SI, does not appear in The Wealth of Nations in any form. The founding text of classical economics, the book that every economics department on earth traces its lineage to, contains a one-line citation of Richard Cantillon about the price of bread, and omits his monetary theory entirely. Everything that happened afterwards follows from that omission, not from a conspiracy. From an editorial decision made in 1776 by a man who was writing a different book, and then the SI itself physically disappears, in a manner that would be comic if the consequences were smaller. It was printed in 1755. The title page says it was translated from the English, which may be true and may mean that Cantillon wrote an English original that burned in Albemarle Street, and we will never know. The title page also says it was printed in London by Fletcher Giles in Holborn. That is a lie, and it is a lie that can be proven with a death certificate, because Fletcher Giles had died in 1741. The book was almost certainly printed in Paris, with a false London imprint to evade the French censors. A second edition followed in 1756, and then, in 1759, a relative named Philip Cantillon published an English book called The Analysis of Trade, which is a mangled, reorganised, partially rewritten version of the SI, with Philip's name on it and Richard's argument inside it, badly handled. Therefore, by the 1760s, the situation was this. The original was anonymous, printed under a fraudulent imprint in French in a small run. The English version in circulation was a corrupted adaptation under the wrong Cantillon's name. The school of thought built on it had renamed its central ideas after Quesnay. And the most influential economics book ever written mentioned the author once, about wages. The idea did not get suppressed. It got orphaned. And an orphaned idea in the 18th century simply stopped existing. For 126 years. The rescue, when it came by accident, and the accident is so absurd that it is worth telling properly. In 1881, William Stanley Jevons, one of the founders of modern mathematical economics, and a man with a professional obsession with tracking down obscure sources, was reading The Wealth of Nations and hit that one line about Mr. Cantillon. He went looking for the source. He found Philip Cantillon's Analysis of Trade, which was the only Cantillon anyone in England had heard of, and the passage Smith cited was not in it. That should have been a dead end. Instead, Jevons kept pulling, worked out that there was an earlier French SI behind the English adaptation, went to find a copy, and discovered that he already owned one. He had bought it years earlier in Paris, presumably for very little, and it had been sitting on his own shelves the entire time. He published the result in the Contemporary Review in January 1881, in an essay titled Richard Cantillon and the Nationality of Political Economy, and he did not hedge. He wrote that the SI is, more emphatically than any other single work, the cradle of political economy. The cradle, not a precursor, not an influence. The cradle. Hayek, writing 50 years later, put the situation with a bluntness that still lands. He observed that the SI, having greatly influenced the moulding of a science and fully articulated it for the first time, was at once entirely forgotten. And he added, about the state of scholarship on Cantillon, that practically everything we know about the man is due either directly to Jevons or to the research that Jevons inspired. The research Jevons inspired produced Henry Higgs's scholarly English edition, published for the Royal Economic Society by Macmillan in 1931, which is the version in general circulation today. 1931 also produced a German edition, translated by Hella Hayek, with an introduction and textual commentary by her husband Friedrich. And in 1986, Antoine Murphy published the biography that reconstructed the lawsuits, the fire, and the man in Surinam. That is the entire scholarly apparatus. One accidental rediscovery, one scholarly edition, one German translation, one biography. For the document Jevons called the cradle of the discipline. Now, at this point in the story there is a very tempting move available, and I am going to refuse to make it, because the tempting move is the wrong answer, and the wrong answer is comfortable. The tempting move is to say it was suppressed, that the establishment buried Cantillon because his analysis was inconvenient to the people who benefit from monetary expansion. It has all the right ingredients. A dispossessed Irish Catholic outsider, an aristocrat who sat on the manuscript for 16 years and considered publishing it under his own name, a false imprint, a plagiarized English edition, a one-line citation in the canonical text, and 126 years of silence. But that reading gives the institutions too much credit. Suppression requires that somebody understood the significance of the thing and decided to hide it. Suppression is a compliment. It means the idea was recognized as dangerous. What actually happened is worse and much less flattering. And to explain it, I have to take you to the moment when money stopped being a sequence of transactions between named human beings and became a letter in an equation. In 1750, 2-3 years before the SI was printed, David Hume published an essay called Of Money, and inside it is one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of economics. Hume asks you to imagine that by miracle every man in Great Britain should have £5 slipped into his pocket in one night. It is a beautiful image, and it is almost right, and the gap between almost right and right is where the last 3 centuries of monetary politics live. Hume's £5 arrives everywhere simultaneously and in equal amounts. Every pocket, same night, same sum. And because it arrives that way, Hume's conclusion is that the effect is a proportionate rise in all prices and nothing else. Everyone has more money, everything costs more, and in real terms, nobody has moved relative to anybody else. Money is a veil. Lift it, and the economy underneath is unchanged. Cantillon's money does not arrive that way. It arrives through a hole in the ground in one province, into the hands of a named list of people at a specific time, and it walks outward from there at a speed set by human commercial behaviour. Murray Rothbard, who was not a temperate man on this subject, called Hume's treatment a considerable deterioration from that of Richard Cantillon, and his reasoning is precise. Cantillon did not believe in aggregate proportionality. Cantillon performed what Rothbard called a sophisticated microprocess analysis of money going from one person to the next, including an income effect that Hume left out entirely. Whether Hume had read Cantillon is genuinely unresolved. The manuscript was circulating in French aristocratic circles before Hume wrote, and Hume was in France. But there is no documentary evidence of him reading it, and the honest position, argued by among others the monetary theorist Arthur Marget, is that both men were drinking from a shared intellectual well, and Hume drank the shallower part of it. Here is why that matters more than a footnote in the history of ideas. Hume's version is the one that won. Not because it was better, because it was tractable. If money arrives equally and simultaneously, then you can write it as a single quantity. And if you can write it as a single quantity, you can put it in an equation. Irving Fisher, at Yale in the early 20th century, gave that equation its canonical form. The quantity of money multiplied by the velocity of its circulation equals the price level multiplied by the volume of transactions. 4 letters. It is elegant, it is genuinely useful for thinking about long-run averages, and it has one property that I want you to look at directly. There is no room in it for a person. The price level is one number. It is an average over the entire economy. Money is one number. There is no first recipient in that equation, and there is no last recipient, because there is no recipient at all. There is a stock and a level. Cantillon's Q is not disproven by that equation. It is not addressed by it. It has been dimensionally removed, in the same way that a photograph removes the third dimension. Nothing has been hidden. The information simply has nowhere to sit. Meanwhile, the analysis survived, in exile, on the continental fringe of the profession. Ludwig von Mises picked it up in 1912 in The Theory of Money and Credit, and made the non-neutrality of money a foundational commitment rather than a curiosity. Mises's position was that money is never neutral. That changes in the money supply diffuse step by step through the economy, altering relative prices as they go, and that this diffusion redistributes real wealth from the people the money reaches late to the people it reaches early. He restated it in Human Action in 1949 and never wavered on it in 50 years of writing. And then Friedrich Hayek, who, as we have established, had personally translated and annotated Cantillon in 1931, published his London School of Economics lectures in the same year under the title Prices and Production. That book is what made him famous at 32 years old. Its central apparatus is the observation that where new money enters an economy determines which stage of production gets distorted, and by how much, and that the distortion is not a general inflation of everything, but a specific bending of the structure of capital toward whatever the injection point happens to feed. That is Cantillon, formalized with a diagram attached. There is a genuine dispute, incidentally, about who first attached Cantillon's name to the effect. The most commonly cited answer is Mark Blaug in the 3rd edition of Economic Theory in Retrospect, published by Cambridge University Press in 1978 on page 159. Some scholars point to the 4th edition in 1985, and settling it definitively would require someone to physically compare the two printings. What is not in dispute is that the man had been dead for 244 years before the mechanism he discovered was named after him. And this is where I need to stop and correct something, because there is a version of this story circulating online that is doing real damage to the argument, and it is the version where the Cantillon effect is a fringe Austrian talking point. It is not. That framing is wrong on the facts, and I want to be specific about why, because being wrong about this is what allows the whole subject to be dismissed. The Cantillon effect is documented in the official publications of the Bank of England, which we will come to, in language more direct than the people who invoke Cantillon on the internet would dare to use. It is embedded in the leading edge of academic macroeconomics through a class of models we will get to in a moment. It is traceable through Hume, through Smith, through the physiocrats. It is in Henry Thornton in 1802 and in Nut Wixell at the end of the 19th century. Thornton was a director of the Bank of England an evangelical member of parliament, and the author of a treatise on paper credit that examined precisely how an expansion of banknotes affects different classes of holder at different times, and he was writing it while sitting on the board of the institution doing the expanding. Wixell, from Uppsala, built the analysis of what happens when the rate of interest charged by banks diverges from the rate that would balance saving against investment, and the entire mechanism of his cumulative process depends on the fact that the divergence reaches borrowers before it reaches everybody else. A Bank of England director in 1802, a Swedish professor in 1898, an Austrian at the London School of Economics in 1931, and the American Economic Review in 2018. That is not a fringe. That is a lineage, running continuously through the centre of the discipline, describing the same mechanism and being systematically excluded from the models that the discipline actually uses to make decisions. The position itself is mainstream. What was never mainstream was a model capable of representing it, and those are two completely different things that get conflated constantly. While I am correcting things, here is a second one, and this one is going to annoy some people. The Federal Reserve does not print money. I am aware of how that sounds. Stay with me, because the actual mechanism is more interesting than the slogan, and understanding it is the difference between having an argument you can win and having one you cannot. The Bank of England published a paper in the first quarter of 2014 in its quarterly bulletin written by Michael Maclay, Amar Radia and Ryland Thomas, titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy. It is a central bank explaining, in public, in plain English, how money actually comes into existence, and what it says contradicts what is taught in most undergraduate economics courses. The majority of money in the modern economy, the paper states, is created by commercial banks making loans. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money, and the paper goes out of its way to demolish the textbook version. Banks do not simply lend out deposits that savers place with them, nor do they multiply up central bank money. The Federal Reserve creates bank reserves. Reserves are a form of money that only banks can hold and only banks can use, and they sit in accounts at the central bank. When the Fed buys a bond, it credits the seller's bank with reserves. That is not the same operation as putting dollars in your account, and the difference is not pedantic, because it explains something that otherwise looks like a fatal hole in the entire Cantillon argument. Between 2008 and 2015, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from roughly $870 billion to around $4.5 trillion. It quintupled. Consumer price inflation over that period was low, occasionally alarmingly low, and the Federal Reserve spent several years worrying publicly that it was too low. A lot of people who had confidently predicted hyperinflation in 2009 were still explaining themselves in 2019. If money creation mechanically produces consumer inflation, that period should not have happened. It did happen, and the reason it happened is the reserve and deposit distinction. The new money went into the banking system's reserve accounts and into the price of financial assets, and it very substantially did not go into household deposits and household spending, because it was never handed to households. The prices that rose in that period were asset prices, which is precisely, exactly, mechanically what Cantillon predicts. He does not say that new money raises all prices. He says it raises the prices of the things the first recipients buy. In 1730, the first recipients were mine owners and their smelters, and what they bought was meat and wine and fine cloth, and the price of meat tripled while other goods lagged. Between 2009 and 2015, the first recipients were financial institutions, and what they bought was securities, and the price of securities went up, while the price of a haircut did not. The reason the 2020 episode looked so different and felt so different in your bank account is that in 2020 the monetary expansion was paired with something the 2008 response never had. Direct fiscal transfers to households. Cheques with people's names on them. That put new money into the deposit layer rather than only the reserve layer, and it did it at the same moment that global supply chains stopped functioning. And the result was the first consumer inflation in 40 years in most of the developed world. 2 injections, 2 entry points, 2 completely different distributions of consequences. Same underlying mechanism, described in 1730. But I said the erasure of Cantillon was worse than suppression, and I have not yet shown you why. Here is why. Sometime in the 1970s and 80s, macroeconomics adopted a modelling convention. It was not adopted for political reasons, and I have found no evidence anyone thought about its political implications at all. It was adopted because the mathematics was otherwise intractable, and because a Nobel Prize-winning argument had just demonstrated that models without it were unreliable for policy analysis. The convention is called the representative agent. To build a model of an entire economy that you can actually solve, you assume that all households can be treated as one household, one agent, with one set of preferences, one budget constraint, one income, one portfolio. You scale it up. The economy becomes an enormously large single person deciding how much to consume and how much to save. This is the foundation of the class of models known as dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are the workhorse forecasting and policy analysis tools of essentially every major central bank on Earth, and have been for decades. Now look at what that assumption does to Cantillon. In a representative agent model, there is exactly one recipient of new money. Therefore there is no first recipient and no last recipient. Therefore there is no queue. Therefore there is no order of arrival. Therefore there is no transfer, because a transfer requires 2 parties and there is only one party, and any transfer from the agent to the agent nets to precisely 0 by construction. The Cantillon effect is not judged to be small in these models. It is not measured and found insignificant. It cannot appear. It is not a quantity the model has the capacity to represent, in the same way that a thermometer cannot report on the colour of a room. Remember what I told you at the beginning about hiding things. This is it. This is the instrument. Nobody built it to conceal anything. It was built because the alternative was mathematically impossible with the computers available in 1982, and because the people building it were trying to solve a different problem. And then the profession trained 2 generations inside it, and those generations went to work at central banks, and the models became the language in which monetary policy was discussed, evaluated, defended, and justified. For roughly 40 years, the primary analytical apparatus used to decide how much money to create was structurally incapable of registering who received it. That is not suppression. Suppression would have been better, because suppression at least implies that somebody knew. The correction, when it finally arrived from inside the building. In March 2018, the American Economic Review published a paper by Greg Kaplan, Benjamin Mole and Giovanni Violante titled Monetary Policy According to Hank. Hank stands for Heterogeneous, Agent New Keynesian, and heterogeneous is the operative word. It means the model contains different people with different amounts of wealth, different portfolios, different amounts of cash on hand, holding assets of different liquidity, matched to the actual observed distribution of American wealth rather than to an average. They ran a change in interest rates through that model, and they ran the same change through the standard representative agent version. And they compared where the effect came from. In the representative agent model, almost the entire effect of a rate change operates through what economists call intertemporal substitution. which is the single agent deciding to consume now rather than later because the price of waiting has changed. The paper's language is that substitution drives virtually all of the transmission. In the heterogeneous agent model, that channel is minor. The indirect effects, the general equilibrium effects that run through the distribution, through who has liquid assets and who does not, through whose income changes and whose does not, far outweigh the direct effects. Read that carefully, because it is a formal admission with an equation behind it. When you allow the model to contain more than one person, the distribution stops being a side effect of monetary policy and becomes the mechanism of monetary policy. The redistribution is not a regrettable consequence of the transmission. The redistribution is how the transmission physically occurs. Cantillon wrote that in 1730. It entered the flagship journal of the American economics profession in 2018. 288 years. Therefore, having established that the mechanism is real, that it is mainstream, and that the instruments were blind to it for 4 decades, the only remaining question is what the machine actually did the last time it was switched on at full power. And this is the part where I have to ask you to hold a lot of numbers. So I am going to be careful about which ones I give you, and every one of them comes from the issuing institution itself, rather than from anyone with an argument to make. Before the 2008 crisis, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was around $870 billion. Almost entirely Treasury securities. Essentially no mortgage-backed securities at all. That is the pre-crisis baseline for the entire monetary base of the world's reserve currency. By October 2014, after 3 rounds of quantitative easing, it was about $4.5 trillion. And then 2020 happened, and it went to $8.965 trillion at its peak in April 2022. That is roughly 36% of the entire annual output of the United States, held on the books of a single institution. The pandemic-era expansion alone, on top of everything that had already been done since 2008, was on the order of $4.8 trillion of newly created central bank money. There are roughly 131 million households in the United States. 4.8 trillion divided among them is about $37,000 per household. I want to be very precise about what that number is and is not, because this is where sloppy versions of this argument fall apart. $37,000 was not created and given to households. Nobody received it. That is the point. That is the entire point. $37,000 per household of new money was created and injected into the financial system through a specific set of doors, and the question that Cantillon spent 4 pages on in 1730 is which doors, and who was standing behind them. The broad money supply tells the other half of the story. The measure called M2, which includes the deposits that ordinary people actually hold and spend, stood at roughly $15.4 trillion at the start of 2020. By early 2022, it was about $21.7 trillion. That is an increase of about 41% in 2 years, against an average annual growth rate of around 5% for the whole of the previous decade. The year-over-year growth rate peaked at 26.9% in February 2021. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, in a note by Christopher Neely, published in May 2023, put that rate in context without any editorial flourish at all. It easily exceeds, they wrote, the rates of growth during either the quantitative easing programs of 2008 to 2015 or the inflations of the 1970s and 1980s. That is the Federal Reserve's own regional research bank, noting that it had just done something monetarily larger than the 1970s. $6.3 trillion of new broad money across a population of roughly 331 million people is about $19,000 per person. And then M2 contracted at record rates. Through 2022 and 2023, which is a detail almost nobody mentions and which we will come back to, because it tells you something about who absorbs the reversal as well as who absorbs the expansion. Now, Cantillon's question. Which doors? The Federal Reserve does not buy securities from the public. It cannot walk into a market and bid. It transacts through a set of designated counterparties called primary dealers, and the roster is published on the website of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and there were 24 of them. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Securities, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup Global Markets, Bank of America Securities, Barclays, BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank Securities, HSBC Securities, Nomura, UBS, Cantor Fitzgerald, the Bank of Montreal through its Chicago branch, the Bank of Nova Scotia through its New York agency. NatWest, Credit Suisse was on the list until it was removed, effective the 30th of June, 2023, for reasons that were widely reported at the time. Those firms are obligated to participate in open market operations and to bid at every treasury auction. In exchange, they are the first and in many cases the only parties who transact directly with the institution that creates dollars. When the Federal Reserve decides to add $1 trillion of new reserves to the financial system, that $1 trillion does not appear evenly across the economy. It appears in the accounts of about 24 firms in exchange for securities, at prices those firms are quoting, in advance of any other participant knowing the size or the timing of the operation. That is the mine. Those are the smelters and the refiners. And in 2020 the arrangement was made more explicit than at any previous point in American history, and it was done in public, and almost nobody outside of finance noticed. On the 23rd of March, 2020, the Federal Reserve announced two facilities called the Secondary Market Corporate Credit Facility and the Primary Market Corporate Credit Facility. For the first time, the Central Bank of the United States would buy corporate debt, not government debt, the bonds of individual private companies. The investment manager appointed to run those facilities was BlackRock Financial Markets Advisory, a division of the largest asset manager in the world, an institution which was simultaneously one of the largest issuers of the corporate bond exchange traded funds that the facility would be buying. The secondary market facility began purchasing exchange-traded funds on the 12th of May, 2020. It began buying individual corporate bonds on the 16th of June, and the Federal Reserve's own description of how it would source those securities states that it began by transacting with primary dealers that meet the eligible seller criteria. The first buyers were the 24. Again, now think about what an eligible seller actually possesses in that situation. Not a subsidy, not a bailout check, something considerably more valuable. Advanced knowledge that a buyer with unlimited funds and no price sensitivity is about to enter a specific market. Anyone holding those assets before the announcement received an instantaneous revaluation of their entire book. Anyone positioned to be the counterparty received a flow of business at a spread they were substantially setting themselves. Being the first seller to an entity that cannot run out of money is the closest thing to owning a silver mine that the 21st century has produced. And you can watch the consequences propagate outward from those doors in the order Cantillon specified, if you know which prices to look at. Corporate credit went first, because that was the market the facilities were pointed at. Investment-grade bond spreads, which had blown out to crisis levels in March, collapsed back toward normal within weeks, and they did so substantially before the facilities had bought anything of consequence. The announcement alone repriced the entire asset class. The Federal Reserve barely had to spend money, because the credible promise to spend money was worth almost as much as the money. Companies that had been unable to issue debt at any price in early March were issuing record volumes by May at yields lower than they had paid before the pandemic began. Then, it reached the outer edge of the risk spectrum, which is where you can see the distortion most clearly, because that is where the new money goes when the sensible things have already been bought. 2020 and 2021 produced the largest boom in blank check companies in financial history. A special purpose acquisition company, a SPAC, is a listed shell with no operations and no assets other than cash, whose entire proposition is that the people running it will find something to buy later. Hundreds of them came to market. Companies with no revenue at all achieved valuations in the billions on the basis of projections extending a decade forward. The initial public offering market ran hotter than at any point since the year 2000. None of that had anything to do with a pandemic response, and all of it is exactly what Cantillon describes when he says the new spending is directed according to the idea of those who acquire the money. The first recipients in 1730 bought better cuts of meat and more ornamented houses because that is what a newly wealthy mine owner wants. The first recipients in 2020 bought risk because that is what an institution with an excess of cash and a mandate to generate returns wants, and the price of risk was bid up accordingly while the price of a loaf of bread had not yet moved. The Paycheck Protection Program is the counterexample that proves the rule, and it deserves credit for being an attempt to inject money at a completely different door. Nearly $800 billion in forgivable loans routed to small businesses through commercial banks. That is closer to the household layer than anything in 2008, and it was administered at speed through intermediaries who earned fees on volume, with verification procedures that were relaxed precisely because speed was the priority, and the estimates of fraudulent disbursement run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The fastest actors captured a very large share of it, and the fastest actors in any process are the ones who already have the infrastructure to move quickly, which is to say, the ones who were already closer to the front. Even the deliberate attempt to inject at the back of the queue was harvested substantially by the front, because the front is defined by speed and the back is defined by waiting. But the mechanism is only half the story, and the half that matters to you is what happened at the other end of the queue. Between the 23rd of March, 2020, when the Standard & Poor's 500 bottomed at around 2,237, and the last trading day of 2021, when it closed around 4,766, the American equity market more than doubled. 21 months. In the middle of a pandemic that had shut down substantial portions of the physical economy. Housing did the same thing. The Standard & Poor's CoreLogic Case-Shiller National Home Price Index posted a 13.2% annual gain in March 2021, and the managing director who publishes that index, Craig Lazara, described it in the release in language that is worth quoting exactly. The National Composite's 13.2% gain, he wrote, was last exceeded more than 15 years ago in December 2005. He is telling you, in a routine monthly data release, that American house prices were rising faster than at any point since the peak of the housing bubble that destroyed the global financial system. And they kept rising. From the beginning of 2020 to the peak in mid-2022, the national index rose by more than 40%. If you owned a house in 2020, you got richer by roughly 40% of your house without doing anything. If you were saving to buy one, the thing you were saving for moved away from you faster than you could save. That is the queue. That is what it looks like when it is happening to you. And now the other side of the ledger, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is to say from the American government's own statistical agency, using its own series, published monthly, in public, the entire time. Real average hourly earnings in the United States fell. not slowed. Fell from April 2021 to April 2023, the increase in consumer prices outpaced the increase in hourly earnings every single month. Every month for 2 consecutive years. The Bureau's own analysis notes that this is the longest such stretch in the history of the series. At the worst point, in June 2022, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers was up 9% year over year, while hourly earnings were up 5.4%. That is a real decline of 3.2% in a single year, which the Bureau records as the second largest in the history of the series. For 2021 taken as a whole, average wages rose about 4.7% and consumer prices rose about 7.1%. A real wage cut of roughly 2.3%. Delivered to essentially every wage earner in the country by nobody, on no one's instruction, with no announcement. Hold those 2 facts next to each other, because this is the entire argument in 2 lines. The asset holder's position rose by 40% or more. The wage earner's real income fell for 24 consecutive months, the longest run ever recorded. Same country, same 2 years, same monetary event. Neither of those groups did anything differently. Nobody worked harder, nobody worked less. The wage earner did not make a bad decision, and the asset holder did not make a good one. The only variable that differed between them was their position relative to the point at which the new money entered the system. Which is what Cantillon said, which is the thing he wrote down while being sued by the people he had done it to. I want to give you the distributional data, and then I want to give you the counter-argument properly, because there is a real one, and if I skip it I am doing to you what the textbooks did. The Federal Reserve maintains a dataset called the Distributional Financial Accounts. It exists specifically to answer the question that the representative agent model cannot ask. Who holds the wealth? By late 2020, the top 1% of American households held about $34.2 trillion, which was 30.4% of all household wealth in the country. The bottom 50% of households, 165 million people, held about 2.1 trillion, 1.9%, 15 to 1, between 1% of the population and half of it. By the third quarter of 2025, the top 1% share had reached 31.7%, which is the highest figure in the entire series since it began in 1989. In dollar terms, that is on the order of 55 trillion, which is roughly equal to everything owned by the bottom 90% of American households combined. The composition matters more than the totals. The top 1% hold more than half of all the national wealth that sits in stocks and mutual funds. The wealth of the bottom 90% is overwhelmingly home equity, and that same group carries around 3/4 of all the household debt in the country. One group's balance sheet is made of assets whose prices central bank operations directly support. The other group's balance sheet is made of a house they owe money on and a wage that is a fixed number until somebody agrees to change it. Then there is the number that made the newspapers for about a day and a half. Between the 18th of March, 2020, and the 15th of October, 2021, the collective wealth of American billionaires increased by $2.071 trillion. That is a rise of 70.3%, from about $2.947 trillion to about $5.019 trillion. The number of American billionaires went from 614 to 745. Those figures come from an analysis of Forbes data by the Institute for Policy Studies and Americans for Tax Fairness, published in October 2021. 19 months. 70% during the largest economic contraction since the Second World War. And here is the number that I think is the most honest and the most devastating in the entire data set, and it comes from the Federal Reserve's own staff. In a Fed's note published on the 30th of August, 2021, by a team led by Michael Batty, they found that the wealth of the bottom 50% of American households rose by about 30% during the pandemic. 30%. That is faster, in percentage terms, than any other group in the country. If you wanted to write a press release saying that pandemic policy was progressive, that is your sentence, and it is true. And then the same study reports that the bottom 50% received 3.3% of the total increase in wealth. Both of those things are true at once, and understanding why is understanding everything. If you own almost nothing, a 30% increase on almost nothing is still almost nothing. Percentages flatter the poor, and dollars flatter the rich. And every institution that wants to tell you the expansion was fair will hand you the percentage, and every institution that wants to tell you it was theft will hand you the dollars, and both of them will be telling you the truth. The top 1% share of national wealth rose by 2.2 percentage points over that recovery. When the base is $30 trillion, 2.2 percentage points is a number with 12 digits in it. But I promised you the counter-argument, and here it is, and I want to hand it over with both hands rather than set it up to knock down. In July of 2012, the Bank of England published a paper in its quarterly bulletin titled The Distributional Effects of Asset Purchases, written by Venetia Bell, Michael Joyce, Zwoshi Liu, and Chris Young. This is not a critic of the bank. This is the bank, in its own official publication, assessing what it had just done to its own population. The paper states that asset purchases financed by issuing reserves unavoidably have distributional implications. Unavoidably, that is the Bank of England's word, in print in 2012. It goes further. It states that the programme boosted the value of households' financial wealth held outside pension funds, but that holdings are heavily skewed, with the top 5% of households holding 40% of these assets. And it gives its own assessment of the mechanism, which is that asset purchases have pushed up the price of equities by at least as much as they have pushed up the price of gilts. Equities are held by the wealthy. Gilts, government bonds, are the thing the bank was ostensibly buying. The bank is stating, in its own bulletin, that the primary price effect of its programme showed up in the asset class held disproportionately by the richest 20th of the country. A later Bank of England staff working paper, examining the interest rate cuts of 2007 to 2009 and the first £375 billion of asset purchases, found that between the 2006 to 2008 period and the 2012 to 2014 period, the wealthiest 10% of British households saw their measured real wealth rise by about £350,000 each in cash terms. £350,000 per household, in the top decile, over 6 years, published by the institution that did it. That is the Cantillon effect quantified in pounds sterling by the Bank of England, and it did not leak. It is on their website. Now the other half, and this is the part that the popular version of this argument systematically omits. The same 2012 paper insists, in the same document, that without the bank's asset purchases the majority of people in the United Kingdom would have been worse off. Its reasoning is that economic growth would have been lower, unemployment would have been higher, and many more companies would have failed and taken their employees with them. That claim is not obviously false, and it may well be correct, and if it is true, then the accounting gets genuinely difficult, because the alternative to a policy that made asset holders much richer may have been a policy that made wage earners considerably poorer than they in fact became. The later Bank of England staff work makes the case more carefully. Quantitative easing supports employment, And employment income matters more in the middle of the distribution than at the top. It supports house prices, and housing wealth is the main asset of the middle of the distribution rather than the top. And it erodes the real value of debt, and the bottom 90% hold 3/4 of the debt, which means inflation is a transfer to debtors from creditors, and the debtors are not the rich. Hold all three of those at once. A monetary expansion raises asset prices, which is regressive. It supports employment, which is progressive. And it devalues debt, which is progressive. The net effect depends entirely on the relative size of three channels operating in opposite directions on different timescales, and the Hank literature that finally gave us the tools to measure this concluded that the indirect employment channel can dominate the direct one, which means that the honest position on quantitative easing specifically, as a policy, is that its overall distributional effect is contested, and anyone telling you it is settled in either direction is telling you about their politics rather than about the evidence. I am going to take a position anyway, because refusing to take one when the evidence is asymmetric is its own kind of dishonesty, and I want you to be able to see exactly where my reasoning could be attacked. Here is the asymmetry. The asset price channel is measured. It shows up in index values you can look up, in transaction prices, in the Bank of England's own published assessment of its own programme, in the Case-Shiller Index, in the distributional financial accounts. It is observation. The employment channel is modelled. It is a counterfactual. It says that unemployment would have been higher in a world that did not occur. That counterfactual may well be correct, and I am not dismissing it, but it is a different epistemic object entirely from a price you can read off a screen. One of these things is a measurement, and the other is a very well-informed estimate of a world nobody visited. And notice who bears the burden of proof under the standard framing. The asset holder's gain is treated as an unfortunate side effect requiring no justification. The wage earner's loss is treated as hypothetically smaller than an alternative loss in a hypothetical scenario. The person whose real income fell for 24 consecutive months is being asked to accept a model output as compensation. That is a defensible position. It is not a neutral one, and the fact that it is presented as neutral, as technocratic, as simply what the analysis shows, is the thing I object to more than the policy itself. Because there is one feature of this that no employment channel argument touches, and it is the feature Cantillon identified, and it is the reason this is not merely a story about the last 5 years. In 1545, a llama herder on a mountain in what is now Bolivia found silver. The mountain was called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill, and the city that grew at its base was called Potosi, and within a few decades it was one of the largest cities in the world at an altitude of over 4,000 meters. In the middle of nowhere, populated by people who had been brought there under a forced labor draft to dig. The silver of Potosi is the single largest monetary event in European history before the 20th century, and the reason it matters here, the reason I am not telling you this as a colourful aside, is that the Spanish crown made a decision about logistics that turned the entire episode into a controlled experiment on Cantillon's mechanism, 2 centuries before Cantillon was born. All legally registered treasure from the Americas had to pass through a single institution, the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, established in Seville in 1503. Every registered ingot, one building, in one city, in one province of Spain. The silver did not arrive in Europe. It arrived in Seville. Earl Hamilton, an American economic historian, spent years in the Spanish archives and published the results in 1934 under the title American Treasure and the Price Revolution in Spain. He reconstructed both the quantities and the prices. Around 3,915 metric tons of silver by the official registrations. which understates the true figure because it counts only what was declared. And prices in Spain rose roughly sixfold over about 150 years. Sixfold sounds catastrophic until you divide it out, and this is a detail I want to be careful about because it cuts against a lot of loose talk. Sixfold over 150 years is an annual rate of somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. That is not hyperinflation by any definition. A modern central bank would consider that rate slightly below target. The Spanish price revolution was not a currency collapse. It was a slow, grinding, century-and-a-half long redistribution. And the distribution is the point. The regions closest to the entry point, Andalusia and New Castile, saw prices rise first and earliest. The effect propagated outward from Seville with a measurable lag. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because that is how money physically moves when it comes in through one door. The people who owned the door got wealthy. The people who owned Spanish farmland on long leases and the artisans on customary wages absorbed the adjustment. Spain ended the period with the largest treasure inflow in world history and an industrial base that had been priced out of its own markets by cheaper Dutch and English goods, which is precisely the second half of Cantillon's argument. The part about the money necessarily going abroad to pay for imports, and the state becoming in a way dependent on foreigners. He may well have had Spain in mind when he wrote it. The example was 2 centuries old and sitting in plain view. Incidentally, the same episode produced the first clear statement of the quantity theory of money by the French jurist Jean Bodin in 1568, which means the aggregate version of the theory and the sequential version of the theory were both derived from watching Spanish silver, and the aggregate version is the one that got remembered. Then France, in 1790, 5 years after the SI's second edition, and 60 years after it was written, decided to fund a revolution by issuing paper notes against confiscated church land. The notes were called assignats. Within 6 years they were worth effectively nothing. The people who got wealthy were the ones who received assignats early and converted them into land and hard goods before the price adjustment arrived. The people who were destroyed were on fixed incomes, the revolution that began as an assault on aristocratic privilege manufactured through its own currency. A new class of proprietors who had bought the confiscated estates with paper that lost its value the month after the purchase cleared. And then Germany. The German hyperinflation of 1922 and 1923 is the most studied monetary catastrophe in history, and it is usually told as a story about wheelbarrows of banknotes and a loaf of bread costing 1 billion marks. That version is true and it teaches you nothing, because it treats the event as a natural disaster that happened to everybody. It did not happen to everybody. Ask Hugo Stinnes. Stinnes was an industrialist from the Ruhr, born in 1870, and by 1923 the German press was calling him the Inflationskönig, the inflation king. He understood, earlier and more clearly than almost anyone, what the Reichsbank was actually doing, and he built a machine to harvest it. The machine had 3 parts, and it is worth understanding, because it is still running. Part 1. Borrow marks. Enormous quantities of them. The Reichsbank's official discount rate sat at 5% through most of 1922, while inflation ran into triple digits, which means the real interest rate on borrowed money was massively absurdly negative. Every mark he borrowed was a mark he would repay with something worth a fraction of it. Part 2. Convert the borrowed marks immediately into things, not into financial claims denominated in marks, which would evaporate, into coal mines, steelworks, shipping lines, hotels and newspapers. Physical assets with physical output that would still exist and still produce, regardless of what the currency did. Part 3. Wait, let the currency destroy the debt. By 1923, Hugo Stinnes controlled an estimated 1,500 separate enterprises and was the richest man in Germany, and he had built that in about 4 years out of nothing but a correct understanding of where in the queue he was standing and a willingness to act on it before the people behind him could. Meanwhile, the German middle class, the people whose savings were in mark-denominated bank accounts and government bonds and life insurance policies, the people whose incomes were fixed salaries adjusted quarterly at best, were annihilated, not impoverished. Annihilated as a class permanently in about 18 months. The political consequences of that annihilation are the reason the 1930s happened the way they did, and I am not going to develop that here because it deserves its own 2 hours, but the causal chain is not controversial among historians. Stinnes died in April 1924 at 54, and his empire fragmented almost immediately afterwards, which is the kind of ending that would feel like moral justice if it had happened to him before rather than after he had transferred the savings of an entire nation onto his own balance sheet. 4 episodes. Spanish silver across 150 years at 1% a year. French assignats across 6 years at total collapse. German marks across 18 months at a rate that broke the arithmetic. American reserves across 2 years at 41% broad money growth. Different centuries. Different metals, papers, and electronic entries. Different political systems, ranging from a Catholic absolute monarchy to a republic born out of revolution, to a failing democracy, to a modern technocratic central bank with a dual mandate and a public communications strategy. And in every single case the order was the same. The people nearest the point of creation converted new money into real things at old prices. The people furthest from it held fixed nominal claims and absorbed the entire adjustment, every time, without exception. Under every ideology, in every century, at every rate of expansion, whether the expansion was accidental or deliberate, whether the people running it were villains or public servants doing their honest best in a genuine emergency. That last clause is the one I want to underline, because it is where this stops being a story about bad actors. Hugo Stinnes was a predator, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The officials of the Caisse de Contratation in Seville had no theory of money at all and were simply administering a shipping registry. The Federal Reserve in March 2020 was staffed by people who were, as far as I can tell from the record, genuinely trying to prevent a depression during a global pandemic, working 18-hour days using the only instruments they had. The order of the queue did not care about any of that. It produced the same distribution regardless. Which raises the obvious objection, and it is a good one, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dismissal. If the order is that fixed, why not just change it? Fix the policy, elect different people, put the money in at a different door. The answer is that this has been proposed, and the proposal is a genuine falsification test for everything I have told you, and I want to state it clearly, because if I am wrong, this is where I am wrong. Cantillon's mechanism depends entirely on sequence. If new money genuinely arrived everywhere at once, in proportion to what everyone already held, there would be no first recipient, no relative price distortion, and no transfer. Hume's £5 in every pocket in a single night. That is the version where money really is a veil, and if it were ever done that way, the Cantillon effect would not apply. Not reduced. Absent, economists have a term for the closest available approximation, which is a helicopter drop, credited to Milton Friedman, in which new money is distributed directly and equally to the population, rather than through the financial system. It has never been done. Not once, anywhere, in the entire recorded history of money. The 2020 American stimulus payments are the closest anyone has come, and they were not equal, they were not simultaneous with the monetary expansion, They were a small fraction of the total expansion. They were phased out by income. They arrived over months, and they arrived after asset markets had already repriced. The Standard & Poor's 500 bottomed on the 23rd of March. The Federal Reserve's corporate credit facilities were announced on the 23rd of March. The first stimulus payments began reaching bank accounts in the second week of April, by which point the equity market had already recovered a substantial portion of its losses. 2.5 weeks. The queue was 3 weeks deep at the front. And it was 3 weeks deep because that is how long it takes to run a payments file through the Internal Revenue Service. And the securities market repriced in an afternoon. That is not a criticism of anyone's competence. It is a description of a structural property. Financial markets move at the speed of an electronic order. Household income moves at the speed of a payroll cycle or a legislative appropriation or a lease renewal, and those speeds differ by orders of magnitude, and the entire Cantillon effect lives in that gap. As long as some prices in an economy are set continuously by auction, and other prices are set discretely by contract, there is a queue, and the auction is always at the front of it. You cannot vote that away, because nobody set it. It follows from the fact that a bond has a price every second, and a salary has a price every year. And the same asymmetry runs in reverse, which is the part almost nobody thinks about. I mentioned earlier that M2 contracted at record rates through 2022 and 2023, and that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet came down from 8.965 trillion to somewhere around 6.5 trillion by 2025, with the tightening program concluding in December 2025, having reversed roughly half of the pandemic expansion. That is a monetary contraction of historic scale. Now ask Cantillon's question about a contraction. Who feels it first? When money is withdrawn, the first prices to fall are the ones that reprice continuously. Asset prices fall first. And the asset holder is the person with the most flexibility to respond, the most information about what is happening, and in many cases the ability to simply hold and wait, because they were not going to sell anyway. The wage earner's nominal wage does not fall. Wages are famously sticky downward. What happens instead is that hiring stops, hours get cut, and the adjustment arrives as unemployment rather than as a price. And unemployment is not distributed evenly either. It concentrates in the most recently hired, the least credentialed, the youngest, and the most marginal, which is to say the back of the same queue. The expansion arrives as asset appreciation at the front and price inflation at the back. The contraction arrives as a temporary valuation decline at the front and job loss at the back. Both directions run through the same list, in the same order, and the person at the back pays in both phases. That is the finding I find hardest to look at directly, and I want to be honest that I have gone looking for a reason it is wrong, and I have not found one. There is one more thing, and then I want to come back to the man in Surinam. Everything I have described operates without anybody deciding it. There is no meeting. There is no list of names in a drawer. The primary dealers are a published roster on a public website. The facilities were announced by press release, the balance sheet is reported weekly, the distributional accounts are maintained by the Federal Reserve itself. The Bank of England published the words unavoidably have distributional implications in its own bulletin in 2012, and the American Economic Review published the formal demonstration in 2018. None of it is hidden. All of it is on the internet. Anyone can read every document I have cited in this script in an afternoon, for free. And the reason it has almost no effect on public understanding, the reason a monetary event that transferred more real purchasing power than any legislative act in modern history produced no political movement worth the name, is the thing I asked you to remember at the very beginning. The instrument. For 40 years, the primary analytical machinery for evaluating monetary policy could not represent more than one household. When the models cannot see a transfer, the briefing notes do not mention a transfer, and the officials reading the briefing notes do not discuss a transfer, and the journalists interviewing the officials do not ask about a transfer, and the public reading the journalists learns that inflation is a weather event with a percentage attached. You are not lied to. That is the part I keep coming back to. Nobody had to lie to you. The measurement apparatus was built in such a way that the most consequential feature of the phenomenon simply did not produce a reading, and everything downstream of the apparatus inherited the blindness honestly. Cantillon saw it in 1730 because he was not using an instrument. He was standing in the queue at the front of it, holding other people's collateral, counting the people behind him. I want to translate this into a number you can hold, because trillions are meaningless and percentages are worse, and the thing I have been describing has a size in years of your life. Take an American household on the median income across the 4 years from 2020 to 2024. Median household income in that period runs somewhere around $70,000, depending on the year and the measure. That household's real hourly earnings fell for 24 consecutive months in the middle of that stretch, and the cumulative rise in consumer prices over the 4 years was something in the region of 20%. Concentrated heaviest in the two categories with the least discretion attached to them, which are food and shelter. Now take a household in the top decile that owned a house and a portfolio through the same 4 years. Their equity holdings roughly doubled from the March 2020 low. Their house appreciated by 40% or more before the peak. In dollar terms, gains in the low to mid-hundreds of thousands were entirely ordinary for that group, and I am describing an average outcome rather than a spectacular one. Set those side by side, and the arithmetic is this. Over 4 years, the top decile household accumulated, without performing any labour whatsoever, an amount equivalent to several years of the median household's entire pre-tax income. Not their savings, not their disposable income, their entire gross annual earnings several times over, arriving as a revaluation of things they already owned. And during those same 4 years, the median household's real hourly wage went backwards, and the composition of the price rise made it worse than the headline suggests, which is a point that gets lost every time inflation is discussed as a single figure. The categories that rose hardest were food and shelter. Those are the two line items in a household budget with the least discretion attached to them. You cannot substitute away from rent. You cannot defer eating. A household in the top decile spends a small and shrinking fraction of its income on those two categories, which means the headline inflation number substantially overstates what they actually experienced. A household in the bottom half spends the majority of its income on them, which means the headline number substantially understates what it actually experienced. Therefore, the published inflation rate, the single figure that arrives monthly and is discussed as though it applies to everybody, is itself an average that conceals a distribution. The same expansion that appeared as 9% in the aggregate was closer to a rounding error for the household whose costs are mostly discretionary, and closer to a crisis for the household whose costs are mostly rent and groceries. Cantillon's observation about the price of meat tripling while other goods lagged is not a historical curiosity. That is the mechanism by which a single reported number can be accurate and useless at the same time, and it is why arguing about the headline figure is a way of not discussing the distribution. That is the transfer. Nothing about that is metaphorical. Two positions in a queue, measured in the only unit that actually matters to a human being, which is years of your working life. Think about the 26-year-old in 2020 saving for a deposit on a house. They did everything they were told. They saved in cash because you do not put a house deposit in equities. That is the advice every responsible person gives. They held dollars, which is the most conservative, most prudent, most disciplined thing a person can do with money they will need in 3 years. They were the most punished participant in the entire event. The rent they were paying went up. The price of the thing they were saving for went up by 40%, and the purchasing power of the instrument they were prudently holding went down for 24 months straight. Their prudence was the mechanism of their loss. Meanwhile, the person who bought the house in 2019 with a 30-year fixed mortgage received 2 gifts simultaneously. The asset appreciated by 40%, and the real value of the debt they owed on it was eroded by the inflation. They were paid twice for a decision they made before any of this began, and the second payment came out of the deposit of the 26-year-old. Neither of them did anything. That is what I cannot get past. Nobody in that comparison behaved badly, or greedily, or foolishly. One of them was born 5 years earlier than the other. Cantillon named this. Not the housing market, obviously, but the mechanism, and he named it in the specific order. Property owners during the term of their leases. Then their servants. Then all the workmen and fixed-wage earners who support their families on a salary. He put the person on a contract at the end of the list in 1730, and the Bureau of Labour Statistics confirmed the position of the same person using electronic data in 2023, with a note that the run of losses was the longest ever recorded. 293 years, and the list did not reorder. Which brings me back to that letter of the 21st of June, 1730. The one where Cantillon writes that had he stayed in the scheme from the beginning, he never should have had any of these lawsuits. When I first read that line, I took it as self-pity from a man who had been sued for winning. I no longer think that is what it is. He is describing his own position in the queue, and he is describing it accurately. Everybody else in Paris in 1720 was inside the mechanism, being processed by it, unable to see it because they were a component of it. He was operating it, and the price of being the one person who could see the machine, rather than one of the parts moving through it, was that the parts came for him with lawyers for the rest of his life. He is not complaining about injustice. He is noting, with what I now read as something close to weariness, that comprehension is expensive, which is roughly what it costs you as well, on a smaller scale, and I should be honest about that too. Because nothing in this script gives you an action to take. That is not withholding. There genuinely is not one at the individual level, other than understanding your own position, which is worth having and which does not change your position. There is one more layer, and it is the one that changed how I think about ordinary life. So I am going to state it as plainly as I can, and then I am going to stop. Everything I have described is a transfer of purchasing power. That is how it is measured, in dollars and index points and percentages of household wealth, because those are the units institutions keep records in. But purchasing power is not the thing being transferred. Purchasing power is the accounting entry. What is actually moving, in the only terms that a human being experiences, is time. A wage is time converted into money at a fixed rate. That is all a salary is. You hand over a fixed quantity of your remaining life, and you receive a number. And when the purchasing power of that number falls, while the number stays the same, what has been taken from you is not currency. It is the portion of your life that the currency represented. The 26-year-old saving for a deposit did not lose money. They lost the 3 years they spent earning it, and they will have to spend those 3 years again, and they do not have infinitely many 3-year blocks. Meanwhile, the asset holder's gain arrived without any time being spent at all. That is what an asset is, a claim that produces value while you are asleep. Therefore, a monetary expansion is a machine that takes time from people who sell it and gives value to people who own claims, and it does this at a scale and a speed that no tax system on earth is permitted to operate at, without a vote, without a debate, without a line item, and without appearing anywhere in the models used to authorize it. And here is the part that I find genuinely difficult, and I have gone looking for the flaw in it for weeks and I cannot find it. Your position in that queue is inherited. Whether you own assets in your 30s is overwhelmingly determined by whether your parents owned assets, because that determines the deposit, the school, the network, the risk tolerance, and the age at which you were able to buy. Every monetary expansion widens the gap between the position in front of you and the position behind you, and because your children start from your position, each expansion makes the next generation's queue more rigid than the last, which means that over a long enough run, and we are now roughly 80 years into this particular run, a monetary system that creates money through asset markets does not merely redistribute wealth, it hardens a fluid society into a stratified one, not by legislation, not by decree, not by anything anyone would recognize as policy. Through the arithmetic of who receives new money first, repeated enough times that the sequence becomes a structure, and the structure becomes a class. Richard Cantillon was born into the wrong end of exactly that. His family held land in County Kerry for 500 years and lost it by statute because the paper moved and the soil did not. He spent his life climbing to the front of a queue, and when he got there he did the only thing that his particular kind of mind could do with the view. He wrote down where everybody was standing, and then he showed it to almost nobody. That is the detail I cannot leave alone. He did not publish it. He did not petition anyone. He did not warn the Herberts, whose shares he was holding as collateral while he shorted the currency those shares were priced in. He wrote the most complete description of the mechanism that anyone would produce for the next 250 years, and he put it in a drawer, and he kept trading. The manuscript survived by accident. It survived because he had handed a copy to a French aristocrat who sat on it for 16 years and considered publishing it under his own name. Everything else Cantillon wrote burned in Albemarle Street on the night of the 14th of May, 1734, along with a body that may or may not have been his, and that certainly did not have a head. And somewhere after that, on a beach on the northern coast of South America, a man calling himself the Chevalier de Louvigny walked ashore carrying gold, rifles, and a barrel of gunpowder, and when the authorities began asking questions, he left his luggage on the sand and disappeared into the interior of a continent, and nobody in 300 years has found out where he went. If that was him, then the man who mapped the fixed order of who gets rich when money is printed spent the last portion of his life at the absolute front of the queue, holding the only thing that holds its value in every monetary regime in history: metal, weapons, and no fixed address. He knew exactly where to stand. That was the one thing he was never confused about. The Federal Reserve published its balance sheet this week, as it does every week. The distributional financial accounts will be updated next quarter. The primary dealer list is on a public website, and you can read all 24 names in about 15 seconds. The Bank of England's admission that asset purchases unavoidably have distributional implications has been sitting on their servers since 2012 in the quarterly bulletin in searchable text. There is no secret. There has never been a secret. There is a 300-year-old document explaining precisely what happens. An 18-year-old central bank paper admitting that it happens, and a monthly data release from a government statistical agency measuring it happening, and none of it has produced any change whatsoever in the order of the queue. Because the order of the queue is not a scandal to be exposed. Exposure is what happens to things that depend on being hidden. This depends on nothing. It runs on the difference between a price that updates every second and a wage that updates every year, and that difference will exist for as long as money is created in one place and earned in another. Somebody received the last dollar that was created. It was not you. somebody will receive the next one, and it will not be you then either. And the arrangement by which that is true was written down by an Irish banker in 1730, 340 years before your rent went up, and it has never once been wrong. He is still ahead of you. Whatever happened to him on that beach, whoever the body in the fire belonged to, on this one question the man is still standing further forward in the line than you will ever get. And he knew it while he was writing it, and he wrote it down anyway, and he did not tell anyone. You just found out